Good afternoon. Bonne journée tout le monde, bonjour, salut. Bienvenue ici à University of Houston. Welcome to the University of Houston. Nous sommes tellement contents de vous avoir ici. We're so happy to have you here today at Le Paris Noir, Unveiling Black Histories in the City of Light, with our amazing special guest, Kevin Duna. So, my name is Maggie Mahoney. I am the Director of Global Engagement here at the University of Houston. I work in the Institute for Global Engagement, where we help the University of Houston globalize and work on our internationalization strategy. And internationalization is not just study abroad, it's not just international students, it's sharing culture, it's connecting across boundaries and borders. And our office works with students and with faculty staff to ensure that we take such advantage of where we are. The University of Houston is the second most diverse Tier 1 Research 1 institution in the nation, and Houston is that city. Houston, am I right, y'all? Houston is that place where we have so many cultures and so many folks coming together from different backgrounds. We have so many students that show up every day, and they change between cultures. We have bilingual and multilingual students that show up, and they speak in a different language here, or they study a different language. So I'm so proud to say that we boast a really strong language program where French is taught, along with many other languages. So I want to say a hello to our Chair of Modern Classical Languages, Dr. Carrera, who we'll hear from in a minute. We're also very proud to have a very strong African American Studies program, and we'll hear in a minute from Dr. Tara Green as well. And our students are truly incredible, and our faculty and staff really support that. The Institute for Global Engagement is happy to help support multicultural events like the one that we're having today, bringing in guest speakers. And also, we have opportunities for students to connect globally right here on campus. Study abroad, or as we call it here, learning abroad, can be a scary thing because of money. Woo. And because of time, or maybe it's not part of your family culture, or maybe you just aren't sure how to do it. And so we have opportunities like Le Paris Noir today that you can come together and we can connect globally. However, I'm going to give a shout out to our table in the back, and I think that one of our staff members is back there, our Assistant Director of Global Initiatives, Stephen Gensel. If you're interested, students or faculty staff, in what we have to offer for global programs, please check out our table that has resources on learning abroad opportunities en France. Check out our opportunities with the Global Citizens Credential. And we are a full U.S. passport acceptance facility to help you get across borders. If you're a U.S. citizen, you can process that right here on the UH campus. We also have Madame Claudine Giacchetti, who everyone needs to know and love, as part of our French department, and she's sharing our program to Angers this summer, as well as the French program that we have here at the University of Houston. I just want to remind everybody that I'm so excited to come together today, but if you need to step out to go to the restroom, they're out the doors this way, and just right through here. If you want another cup of juice, if you want something else to eat, please feel free to kind of get up and go get that as we continue our conversation. But now I'm going to welcome Dr. Tara Green to the stage to say a welcome from African American Studies as one of our co-hosts for this event. So let's welcome Dr. Green.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. So good to see you all. Welcome to our esteemed guests, and thank you so much for inviting us to be a part of this program. We are the African American Studies Department. We have been a department for about 5 years. However, we have been at the University of Houston since 1969, so over 50 years, which is over half the time this university has been a university. We have had a presence on this campus. Our mission is being shown and illuminated today because we look at all aspects of Africa and the African diaspora. So that may be through the courses that we teach, and we invite you students to look at the courses that we will be offering in the fall and in the spring. We also have a major, so we encourage you to look at that and think about it. And we have a minor. We encourage you to think about that as well. But of course, we do have various kinds of programs. So we are happy to partner with this one today. Last week, we invited we welcomed the Consul General of Angola to campus, and she spoke on health partnerships between the U.S. and Angola. You all may say, well, what did she have to say? You had to be there to hear it, but she is very optimistic about the future, and I was very happy that students had an opportunity to engage with her. Next week will be our AAS week, so we will have a variety of activities taking place. You can find us at AAS Cougs on Instagram, and of course we have a website where we post our activities as well. So we will enjoy this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Green. And I'd like to mention it is Black History Month here at the University of Houston, and this is one of the events that's part of it. It's so important to celebrate Black history here and the way that Blackness is seen across the globe, and so I'm really excited for the conversation. As we get started, I want to have a welcome from Dr. Carrera from Modern and Classical Languages, who's also a co-sponsor.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. This is truly a thrilling event, I think, one of the highlights of our semester. And there are so many people I have to thank for this event today, so allow me to read their names at least. First of all, the Institute for Global Engagement, and Ambassador Pelletier, and everyone, Maggie and others people, Stacy Michael, that are involved. African American Studies, of course. The support of Villa Albertine, as you see, the Department of Modern and Classical Literatures and Cultures at Rice University, the Thomas F. Freeman Honors College, and the College of Liberal Arts and Behavioral Sciences at Texas Southern University, and, of course, the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, of which I am the chair. And therefore, I have to thank especially our wonderful French team, because we have a French major in our department, and actually we are the only institution of higher learning in Houston that has a French major. So take advantage of it. Tell everybody to take advantage of it. Because you will have an education in French language, in French culture. You will have the opportunity to go to France. You will have the opportunity to adopt France, if you want, as your second country. This is something that I recommend to students in other languages that we teach. But French is a major. Many other languages are only a minor. Therefore, it's very important for you to take a look at what our French major is offering and take advantage of it. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Dr. Carrera. So now I'm excited to introduce someone very special to the University of Houston who just joined our community. Stanislas Reiner is the French ETI, the Expert Technique International of French language, and he is a part of a program that the French government has put together to help share France around the United States. And I'm just going to leave it at the basics of that. There's also a French ETI at Rice and one at the University of Texas at Austin for other areas, but Stanislas has done an incredible job getting started only 4 months ago. And moi, je suis Louisianaise. I'm from Louisiana, and he worked in Louisiana for quite some time, so I've loved connecting with him and connecting about the random roots that we all have with the French language, that many of us have, I should say. I take that for granted coming from Louisiana. So I'm going to hand it over to Stanislas to get us started with our program.
Thank you so much, Maggie. So my name is indeed Stanislas. Merci, thank you. I'm happy to be here. First of all, I wanted to thank everyone who contributed to this collaborative effort to make this event possible. So a special thanks to the entire IGE team, and a particular mention also to Stacy Michael, who were behind the scene, and I also extend my gratitude to the entire French program team and Dr. Alexandro Carrera at MCL, Dr. Tara Green and Christopher Knight from African American Studies Department, Dr. Cosinus and the Honor College team at TSU, Dr. Caroline Fash at Rice University, the whole Villa Albertine team and the French consulate in Houston, and everyone else who helped spread the word, and the room is filled. This is great. Merci. Keep in mind that after the talk, be sure to stay. We're going to have a Q&A hosted by Dr. Amanda Verdenberg, And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Kevin Donna, a podcaster, author, and cultural guide whose work has illuminated the rich yet often overlooked narrative of Black history in Paris since 2013. Born and raised in Martinique, Kevin is a licensed tour guide and the founder of Le Paris Noir, a series of walking tours that explore the deep-rooted presence of African and Afro-descendant communities in the French capital. His tour retraced the personal journeys of influential figures such as James Baldwin, Josephine Baker, Aimé Césaire, the Nalda sister, and France Fanon, visionaries who paved the way for movement that continue to resonate on both sides of the Atlantic. Offered in both French and English, his tour go beyond historical landmark, sparkling critical conversation on identity, the concept of race in France versus the US, and the multi-layered experience of Afro-descendant French people. Beyond the streets of Paris, Kevin has made his mark in media. He co-founded Le Chip, a podcast where free Afro-Caribbean and African heritage millennials share their experience of Black life in France with humor and insight, tackling topics such as music, cinema, the news, and new media. Now, for his solo project, dans la Bibliothèque du Paris Noir, created in collaboration with the Fondation pour la Mémoire de l'Esclavage, he continues to explore the legacies of colonialism and Black intellectual thought. His expertise has led him to collaborate with major institutions such as the Quai Branly Museum in France, various US universities. As I mentioned yesterday, was at TSU. It's a great honor to have you here also today at University of Houston and tomorrow at Rice University. And he was also engaged in conversation with leading thinkers, including author Ta-Nehisi Coates, historian Dr. Laurent Dubois, poet Simone Schwarzbart, and filmmaker Simon Monteiro. And soon we'll be able to follow his insight in print. His first book, À la découverte du Paris Noir, A Guided Journey through Black Paris, will be published in spring 2025. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Donna. Merci.
Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you, Stanislas, for the kind words. Thank you, everybody, for being present here. Before I really get started, I need to tell you that all of this thing is almost an accident. I didn't plan to, when I was a kid, when I was a student, I never planned to do tours about the Black history of Paris. It's a series of coincidences and encounters with people that made me a tour guide in 2011. So I was a tour guide before I started focusing on the Black history of Paris, but I decided to do so to engage in a conversation about Black people in Paris because of visitors. A lot of people traveling to Paris for the first time, sometimes they're surprised with diversity in Paris. They had questions for me, and it was hard to answer their questions because the way we talk about identity is very, very, very different in France, and this is something I'm going to focus on during the presentation. So there will be two parts, basically. One part on the left bank, which is more like the intellectual part of the city, and then the right bank that is more immigrant and sometimes a little bit crazier with a tradition of nightlife and partying and jazz music and stuff like that. So this is what the tour is going to be about. And I love to start the left bank tour from my favorite monument in Paris. It's a beautiful place named Le Panthéon, the Pantheon. And it's a place where, for a very long time, the French government celebrates some of the most important heroes of French history, right? So in there, you will see people like Victor Hugo or Marie Curie, like a lot of French legends. And it's one of the few places in Paris where you are going to hear about a French colonial past. So there's one man that I choose to start the conversation with because he and his family are very, very interesting if you want to talk about racial categories, racial identity, even racial ambiguity in France. I'm talking about Alexandre Dumas, one of the greatest French authors of the 1800s. He was accepted in the Pantheon in 2002. And I think this picture here is so interesting because race is very relative, race is very cultural. Here, on this picture, Dumas is wearing an afro. So in America, you could say, oh, Dumas was a person of color. So Dumas was what you guys would call in old American English, you would call him a quadroon. Quadroon means 1/4, 1/4 black. Right? His grandmother was an enslaved woman from Haiti. And if you talk about Haiti, you talk about the French colonial past, right? So back in the 1700s, Haiti was named Saint-Domingue and was the richest French colony in the Caribbean. And back then, 1700, it was quite common for masters and enslaved to have children together. So who is he here? The father of Alexandre Dumas, born in the colony of Saint-Domingue. His mother was an enslaved woman. His father was a French aristocrat from Normandy who lived in the colonies and had children with an enslaved woman. Thomas Alexandre, the father of the future Alexandre Dumas, was his favorite son. So when he was a teenage boy, he took him with him back to France to offer him a proper classical French education. And when he was an adult, he decided to enlist the French military. He became a soldier. And by the time of the French Revolution, the 1790s, he became the first black or mixed race general of the history of the French military. The problem with that story is that it's completely ignored and overlooked. So I told you Alexandre Dumas, the son of this guy, is in the Pantheon. He was one of the greatest French novelists. This is him, and this is how we remember him. Something happened. There's an English word that was adopted not so long ago in French. I saw that on French television like a year ago. The term was le whitewashing. Right? So thank you guys. So this is le whitewashing French edition. On the right, there's a really famous French actor named Gérard Depardieu. Gérard Depardieu is not black, he's not a quadroon. Gérard Depardieu is a white man, but they choose Gérard to play in this film and to be Alexandre Dumas. The movie does not talk about race, the movie is not about race, but still somehow the movie talks about race. Why? Okay, so bear with me because it is about the French language. Right? You ready? So the movie is about the relationship between two authors. One is Alexandre Dumas, everybody knows him. The other guy was named Auguste Maquet. So Auguste Maquet, real person, but back then he was not famous back in the 1800s. Actually, he was working for Alexandre Dumas. What I'm trying to say here is, like a lot of famous artists, Dumas, when he got really big, he was not doing everything by himself anymore, right? He would hire someone else. He would hire another author to help with the dialogues, to help with the archives, to help. In English, you would call this other guy, you would call him a ghost writer. Yes? But that's not the French word. The French word for ghost writer is nègre. N-E-G-R-E. So, he was a white man, but back in the 1800s, they would call him le nègre d'Alexandre Dumas. So there's something interesting about the way we talk about race in France. So why would a ghostwriter be called a nègre? It's because a ghostwriter is a person who doesn't get credit for their work. So there's the idea of slavery, forced labor, or even today the hardest works in one society. About that question, I think for those of you who are interested in the way French people talk about race, this episode of a podcast is so interesting. So this is the story of an American man named Gofin Putubwele. So he's Congolese American. So he grew up in America, but his family is from Congo. So they are Francophone. And when he was in college, he had the opportunity to spend a semester in Paris. So he was real excited about it. But then when he got to Paris, he realized that there were words, there were expressions that were quite different. One day, Ngofin was with French people, and he said, "Je suis noir." "Je suis noir" literally means I am black. There's no pun, there's no hidden message, there's no double entendre. "Je suis noir, I am black." But some French people told him, "Oh, we don't say that. You're not supposed to say, "Je suis noir." Then he asked, "What am I supposed to say?" And they told him, "You're supposed to say, je suis black." Most French people, when they speak in French about black people, les noirs, they refuse to use the word noir, they use the word black. So the whole episode is, why are French people so weird when they talk about race? And also they met with a woman named Nelly Buffon. Nelly is the woman who started the petition to change the word for ghostwriter. Now, officially, you're not supposed to say nègre littéraire anymore. There's a new word that nobody uses. The new word is prête-plume. Prêter is to loan, and plume is a feather. So it's the whole episode is a conversation about the words we're using when we talk about race in France, and all the awkwardness, the malaise about mentioning race, talking about race, acknowledging race, and so on. But back to Dumas. There's a question that comes quite often when I talk about Dumas, especially with a French audience, is, okay, we get it now. Dumas was 1/4 black. So technically, yeah, he was 3/4 white, if you do the math. He was whiter than black. So maybe back in the 1800s, that was not an issue. Maybe people were not even aware of his identity, of his difference. Maybe it's a problem that we created in the 21st century. I must say that sometimes when people ask me the question, I feel a little bit attacked, as if I started it, like nobody knew, and then I invented something. And then I show them this picture, and I didn't start it. So this is an amazing racist caricature from the mid-1800s, and you see the way Dumas is represented on the picture here, on the caricature, and I think we can all agree that back in the 1800s, people had a clue about the black quarter of Alexandre Dumas. I'm not even telling you this whole story to tell you that Dumas was a victim, was a poor victim. Dumas had an amazing life. So at some point, he even built his own castle in the west of Paris, Château de Monte Cristo. People used to say that he paid the castle with the copyrights, the royalties from the book. So voilà, there are many other people I could tell you about when we're standing in front of the Pantheon, but I think Dumas is probably the most interesting one to engage in a conversation about who belongs in which category in France. Next stop, beautiful place, 5 minutes away from the Pantheon. I think it's probably the prettiest garden in Paris, the Luxembourg Garden. There are lots of things to see in the garden, but there's an element that most people never see when they go to the garden. It is a memorial dedicated to the abolition of slavery in the French colonies, right? So on the left, you have the actual memorials with links representing the abolition of slavery. And next to it, there's a sign that reads, through their struggles and their deep desire for dignity and freedom, the slaves of French colonies contributed to the universality of human rights and to the ideal of freedom, equality, and brotherhood founding our republic. France is here paying them a tribute. Right? So there are lots of questions here. Why in this garden? Why in the Luxembourg Garden would you have a memorial dedicated to the abolition of slavery in the French colonies? Long story short, this garden, the Luxembourg Garden, is the property of the French Senate. In 2001, the Senate in France voted a law acknowledging slavery as a crime against humanity on May the 10th, 2001, and then May the 10th became the national day for the commemoration of the abolition of slavery in France. So sometimes people ask me, is it like your Juneteenth? Like, yes and no. Yes, it's an acknowledgement of the abolition of slavery, but it's not a bank holiday. So yes and no. But there are interesting representations, interesting ways to talk about the abolition of slavery. So first thing first, France is a little bit unique on that matter because France is the first country to ever abolish slavery, but France is also the only country to bring slavery back and to abolish slavery a second time. So you have actually two different abolitions, one at the time of the French Revolution. And this representation here is super interesting. It's in the Museum of the History of Paris, Carnavalet Museum in the heart of Paris. And it is the abolition of slavery announced at the Convention. Convention was like the parliament at the time of the French Revolution. And here, it's a sort of, I would say, propaganda. You see people like hugging one another. On the right, there's a black man so happy that he's giving his black baby to some random people he doesn't know. So today, even in the museum, they acknowledge that this vision of the abolition of slavery is in favor of the motherland, of la métropole. This representation of the abolition of slavery does not really include, the struggle, the fight. 1791 is the beginning of the Haitian Revolution in Saint-Domingue. So in a couple of years, the enslaved are going to control the colony. And 6 months before the convention announced the abolition of slavery, slavery was de facto abolished in the colony of Saint-Domingue. And that part of the struggle to abolish slavery is not really well known, not really well studied. And then 1802, Napoleon brought slavery back, which is quite bad. And it's going to start the independence of Saint-Domingue that became Haiti on January the 1st, 1804. So for the other French colonies, slavery went back until 1848. And 1848 is a very, very interesting moment. 1848, there's a new revolution in Paris, a new revolution that calls for a new republic, the Second Republic. So you have to know that right now France is Republic number 5, so it's a lot of instability and stuff like that. And so in 1848, we're going to have a new republic. And you need to understand that in France, the word republic is like a synonym for liberté, égalité, fraternité. So there was a question. Can we be a republic and keep slavery in our colonies? Hell no. So it is the time to abolish slavery for a second time. This is interesting because the idea that France is going to engage in a conversation about slavery is not a coincidence. This is 150 years after the abolition of slavery, and this is in Paris. So 150-year anniversary of Paris, there is an association, Caribbean Association based in Paris, that decided to organize a silent march in memory of their ancestors. A couple of years ago, I interviewed the man that organized the march. And he told me that everybody was surprised with the success of that march. Initially, he didn't know how many people were going to show up. So when you organize a march in Paris, you need to go to the police and they ask you how many people do you expect. And he said, I have no idea, maybe 1,000 people. And on that day, 30,000 people showed up, mostly black people. So the reaction was, it's a lot of black people here today in Paris, you know. And I love talking about that because it is a sort of French position. We don't see color, we do not acknowledge race. And one day you wake up on a Sunday morning and you are surrounded by 30,000 black people. Then you start to ask questions. What are they doing here? What are they talking about? And even the slogans here were a little bit different. Because when I talked about it with Emmanuel Gordien, the doctor that organized the march, he told me that previous generation of black French people, especially Caribbean French people, we were not really open to talk about slavery because our main political goal was to be accepted as regular, normal French citizens. So emphasizing on the history, the legacy of slavery would make us look less French. And then in the 1990s, younger generation said, no, this sort of denial of the history of slavery is part of the problem, so we need to talk about it. And there were some sort of new kind of slogans, like one on this banner that reads, we are all daughters and sons of enslaved people. So there's something interesting about the way this happened. Then it started a conversation, and that woman, who back then was a congresswoman from French Guiana, representing the Department of French Guiana in the French Parliament, she carried a law to recognize slavery as a crime against humanity. That's all good, but what does it change? Is a question I get a lot. Like, the French government said slavery was a crime against humanity. What does it change? Well, the main difference now is curriculum. Like 25 years ago or so, like it was not something very important in the French curriculum, and now there's been some efforts, and I think it's in middle school right now, students learn about the history of slavery. It's not enough, it's not perfect, but it's a real change, a real progress. There's something else that is interesting, is I think representations, pop culture is something quite big. This is 2024, and it's the first French movie, serious movie, about slavery. Like, France is the country of cinema, produces a lot of movies, etc., but for a very long time, there was zero movie about slavery. It's quite interesting. I know that about 10 years ago in America, some people said, okay, enough with all these movies about slavery. France was doing the opposite, zero movie about slavery. And actually, it's not completely true, because before this one, 10 years ago, there was a movie, like the first real French movie about slavery, but it was a comedy. It was the story of two black men from our time who are being cursed. They go back to the Caribbean, and a lot of funny stories happen to them, and they try to go back to the real time. So yeah, not really taken seriously. There's something else. When you leave the Luxembourg Garden, you find yourself, right after the Senate, you find yourself in front of a cafe named Café Tournon, which is a very important place for the history of Black American novelists in Paris. There's an old tradition of Black American artists and intellectuals moving to France. Like you could talk about Langston Hughes, for instance, in the 1920s. But after World War II, one of the major examples is Richard Wright. And the first time I heard about it, about Café Tournon, it's because I read that people like Richard Wright used to hang out here. So this is him in the garden with the Pantheon in the back. I think it's quite cool. And the first time I heard about Café Tournon, the place I was telling you about, was reading the autobiography of this African-American novelist who became much more famous in France than in the US. He was writing detective novels. He was never that successful, but then some of his books were published in France in the 1950s, and he had a couple of bestsellers. It's usually stories of pimps and cops in Harlem, in Brooklyn, and back in the 50s, people thought it was really exciting. And it's not that big in America, except that after he died, this book was adapted in a Hollywood movie, some sort of blaxploitation, A Rage in Harlem with a young Forest Whitaker. So before there was that, that is the book that was adapted in this movie. Last but not least, here, James Baldwin, one of the most important American novelists of the 20th century. What you see back here is a church named Saint-Germain. So the neighborhood Saint-Germain is like the neighborhood for intellectuals in Paris for a very long time. Baldwin first moved to Paris in 1948. And what I love the most about him is the fact that he's really nuanced. Like the world is not good and bad, black and white. It's a little bit more subtle than that. He understood that when he was in Paris as an African American, he had some sort of privileges. Before being a black person, he's an American. He explained that growing up as a poor kid in Harlem, he never really felt that American. And then he moved to France. And whenever he would open his mouth, people were like, oh, Américain. And in a way, he became American in France. So there's something interesting about that experience. Also, there is his sexual identity. Very early, he knew he was gay. And if 20th century France had the reputation to be more tolerant with African-American artists, it was also the same story for LGBT American artists. If you don't know where to start, I think this documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, that came out about 10 years ago, directed by Raoul Peck, Haitian-French director, is a beautiful way to understand the world of James Baldwin. Then we move on to the University of La Sorbonne, still on the left bank, so that will be our last stop on this part of the city. La Sorbonne is the most famous university in Paris. And in 1956, there was a major event taking place at the University of La Sorbonne. It was the first conference of black writers and artists. So right here, you have a Senegalese man named Alioune Diop. In 1947, Alioune Diop created Présence Africaine, African Presence. It's a bookstore, but it's also a publishing house that was in Paris in the Latin Quarter, in the student neighborhood, to give a space and to give a voice to all these Caribbean, black, African-American intellectuals. And in 56, invited some of the most important black intellectuals in the world to talk about the future. The picture here should offend you. Yeah. Because there's a group of people that is really, really underrepresented. And so this is our start when I'm like in situ, I show on my iPad, like, is there anything like bothering you? Women, like the gender dynamic is not that great on the picture. So if you looked at it, you could imagine that back in the 1950s, 40s, 30s, 20s, there were no women involved in this black intellectual movement, but it's actually the opposite. So in the 1930s, there was a movement that was born in the neighborhood, and the name is La Négritude. Négritude is quite similar to the Harlem Renaissance. And La Négritude was founded by 3 young black students. But before there was La Négritude, it was a woman named Paulette Nardal. And these past couple of years, there's been more and more attention given to Paulette Nardal because allegedly she's the first black woman to ever study at the University of La Sorbonne in 1920. She was studying English, so she was fascinated with the people of the Harlem Renaissance, people like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Alain Locke, spending time in Paris. So she had a brilliant idea. She created a salon, a place where people were invited to talk about culture, to talk about arts. And because of her, a lot of cool connections became possible. That is the question right now, because nowadays historians, they know for a fact that there were young men that used to hang out with Paulette. They probably were inspired by conversations they overheard at the sound of Paulette. Then they created their own movement, La Négritude. They became very successful, famous, respected, and they never really mentioned the woman that opened the door. So these past couple of years, there's been a lot of efforts to give some credit on the Nardal sisters. And the first time I heard about them was in 2017, because there was a group of Martinican women that were fighting for Paulette Nardal to be the first black woman accepted in the Pantheon. So she's still not in the Pantheon, there's still conversations, but Paulette Nardal is getting more and more attention for her contributions, and I think it's legitimate. If you want to know more about the conference of 1956, I have a recommendation for you. It's a documentary that came out in 2006. It's available for free on YouTube, and it's French and American. So some parts are in English subtitled in French, and some parts in French subtitled in English. If you want to go deeper, you will understand that this event of 1956 is super interesting because it's a great moment for black studies, but it's not because everybody was black that everybody got along. Being black is basically the only thing they had in common. Other than that, there were Americans and French and Portuguese and British and Catholic and Christian Protestant and Muslims and atheists and communists and capitalists. So in 1 week, they were not going to agree on everything, right? But it was still a great moment because they were able to meet with one another and understand their differences. Now we are going to go to another part of the city. We're crossing the River Seine, and we arrive on the northern part, the right bank of Paris, and we are in the neighborhood of Pigalle. That is really famous for the nightlife. Pigalle is a neighborhood where for a very long time Parisians go really hard. The word we use in French is s'encanailler. And with students, American students, I finally found the right translation in English. That would be when you are slumming it. You know, like you would be from the middle class and you want to party hard with low life. You would go encanailler. So that's the story of Pigalle. And just 2 minutes away from Moulin Rouge, there is a plaque. Here, Josephine Baker, 1906-1975, music hall artist, resistant, civil rights activist, used to hold a cabaret from 26 to 28, promoting jazz and African-American culture. So there's a venue there, and in 2019, they put up this plaque, this sign in honor of Josephine Baker. That was really the fight of an African-American expat named Brian Scott Bagley, who is obsessed with Josephine Baker, so he decided to have the plaque there because in the 1920s, she had a place there. So this is Josephine Baker, and she's probably the most famous African-American woman in French history. She was from St. Louis, Missouri. She was a dancer. She moved to France in the 1920s because she had a lot of ambition. She wanted to become a star. And at the time in France, it was a lot of curiosity, a lot of excitement for black culture. This is great. But also we need to remember that there was a lot of stereotypes with it. This is the first show she was a part of, and as you can tell, it didn't age very well. There was something very stereotypical about it. It's the 1920s, it's a different time, but it's going to make her very visible. And this is interesting because nowadays, a lot of historians, they say that Josephine Baker became the first black icon, international black icon. So this is still her with one of her pets, a leopard named Chiquita. And the young Josephine Baker is quite scandalous. She's not really fighting expectations people had about black people, about the colonies, about Africa, about savages, and that is part of the problem. When nowadays, 100 years later, we think about Josephine Baker, the first images we have in our mind is the picture of a young black woman dancing half naked with a banana skirt. But there are other parts of her life that are quite interesting. Like the sign I was showing you before, it was musical artist and then resistant against the Nazis. So what happened? Before the war, in 1937, Josephine Baker became a French citizen. She was in France for over 10 years, she married a Frenchman. 1939 is the beginning of the Second World War in Europe, and as a tour guide working for Americans in France, I know it's a lot of jokes about how French people were not fighting hard enough in World War II. I know. But In 1939, when the Second World War started, most American expats went back to America because there's a new horrible war happening, starting in Europe. The United States were not involved yet, so most Americans would say, bonne chance, and they would go back home. Not Josephine Baker. In 1939, Josephine Baker became a volunteer for the French Red Cross. The idea of Josephine was, when I came here, I had nothing. Friends gave me everything, so I need to give something back. So 1939, she's a volunteer for the French Red Cross. 1940 is probably the darkest moment in French history. The French military is humiliated. France is being invaded by Nazi Germany. But it's also the beginning of the French resistance. People who said, no, we are going to keep fighting. Josephine Baker became a spy for the French resistance. She explained that she was so famous that the police was not asking for papers, for ID, they were asking for autographs. So she understood that with this level of fame, she could do useful stuff. So she would collect information that she transmitted to the resistance, risking her life for France. That made her a lieutenant of the Free French Forces, and this is why she's wearing a French military uniform with a couple of medals on her chest. And the picture, by the way, of course, it's not in Paris, it is in Washington, D.C., in 1963, the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Movement, and it's also about the contributions of women in the Civil Rights Movement, because of course there were women in the Civil Rights Movement, but when it was time to talk in public, it was mostly men. On that day, the day of I Have a Dream, she's the only woman who spoke publicly. There was something interesting about that. She died in 1975, but before she died, this is interesting as well. Josephine Baker couldn't have children, so she decided to adopt a dozen of children of different origins. I insist on origins, because when I do the tour in French, with French people, if I say Josephine Baker adopted 12 children of different races, like, no, you don't say that, race is not real, don't talk about race, that's racist, blah, blah. So origins. Origins is the French euphemism to say race. So she adopted children of different origins to show the world that these kids, who are very different from one another, could grow up together and see one another as brothers and sisters. And then she died in 1975, and in 2021, something very interesting happened. Josephine Baker was accepted in the French Pantheon. She became the first black woman accepted in the French Pantheon. And if you have questions, we can talk about that moment. I was there. That was very, very beautiful and very moving. But there's something else we need to talk about. We need to talk about the way jazz music came to France in the first place. So 1917 is the First World War, and finally, 1917, America is involved. So lots of American soldiers came over to France to help. But initially, black soldiers were not supposed to fight. There was the idea that they were in France to help with logistics, to cook, to clean, to carry heavy stuff. But the war is happening in France. So French generals were like, okay, we'll have some of these guys. And they were fighting for France as if they were fighting for their own country, and they were nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters. This is super interesting because the reason why on the French side there was no problem in accepting a few thousand black American soldiers, it's because between 1914 and 1918, France imported about 200,000 soldiers from Africa, les tirailleurs. So at the end of the war, a few thousand more black people is not, we say in French, la mer à boire. It's not something that is such a big deal when there are already hundreds of thousands black people fighting. And these guys, the Harlem Hellfighters, they were part of some of the most decisive battles at the end of the war. Some of them were decorated, they were welcome in France. There was something else. They had instruments. They had a band. They were playing a new type of music that no one ever heard in France before, jazz music. 1918, it is a huge success. We have video archives of these young black men being celebrated in the middle of nowhere, deep rural France, being celebrated like saviors. So when the war is over, everybody had to go back home, right? Most of the African soldiers from Senegal, from Mali, from Guinea, from Côte d'Ivoire, they were told, thank you, you guys, you are amazing, now go back to Africa. Yeah, they were not French citizens. They were part of France. They were part of the French Empire. But the term, the legal status was indigène. They were indigenous people to their land, and they could not go back and forth as they wanted. So most of them didn't have civil rights. They had to go back to Africa. So, American soldiers went back to America, and they assumed, black American soldiers thought that when they would go back home, their position would improve. This is not exactly what happened between 1919 and 1921. So because of that, some of them decided to go back to France. And in the neighborhood of Pigalle, in the 1920s, some of the first jazz clubs are opening. This guy right here, his name is Eugene Bullard. He was not a Harlem, he was African American, he was from Georgia, but he was not a Harlem fighter because he came to France before the war. He came to France before the war and started to fight for France before the US got involved in the war. Eugene Bullard, this is a biography of Eugene Bullard, became the first black pilot flying for France. He never really got the credit he deserved, and he died in 1961. And it's over 30 years after his death that the US military, the US Air Force, made him a lieutenant and moved his body in some American US military cemetery as a way to remember him. So it's always took a long time to get the credit. I would love also to mention this movie that came out a few years ago with this star. Is like the first internationally famous black French actor, Omar Sy, and the movie Father and Soldier is about the First World War, and it's about the sacrifices of les tirailleurs, these colonial troops who fought for France. It's a beautiful film. And last part, we arrived in a very, very, very unique, interesting neighborhood. Château Rouge is part of a neighborhood named La Goutte d'Or. La Goutte d'Or, the drop of gold, is like, in English, they call it Little Africa because it's an important black African presence in there. But experts in geography, they say it's not an African neighborhood, it's an African hub. What is the difference? Well, most of the people you will see in there, they don't live there. They might live really far away outside of Paris and take transportation to go to this hub because it's a place where you will find clothing and food and cosmetics and social interactions, especially for African immigrant community. There's also a lot of style. Like the men here, standing here with the red pants is a sapeur. La sape is a typically Congolese tradition with this, there are some sort of dappers, and the idea here is no matter who you are, no matter what is your economic status, no matter what is your legal status, like documented or not, you have the right to wear colors and to walk around the streets of Paris with your head up. So there's something interesting. So it's for a very long time a neighborhood of immigration, and there's always a lot of stories, sad and happy stories related to the neighborhood of Château Rouge. An interesting story is the story of l'Église Saint-Bernard Church, which is a church, a Catholic church in the middle of this neighborhood. And France became a country of immigration around the 1920s. Between the 1920s and 1930s, there was a first important wave of migrations. There was so much immigration in France that they changed the laws to make immigration, like naturalization, easier in 1927. So France became the country of immigration in the 20s and the 30s, and the reason for that is because between 1914 and 1918, First World War, France lost 1.3 million young men. So there was a fear of demographic decay, so there was a lot of immigration coming from the rest of Europe. After the Second World War, more immigration to France, but this time not from the rest of Europe, from the French colonial empire. From the mid-1940s to the mid-1970s, lots of immigration. And I'm not going to say that everything went well and everybody was happy and it was perfect, but immigration back then was considered as a sort of win-win situation, which is positive for the French economy to have immigrant workers doing tough jobs that locals don't want to do anymore. It was something positive also for these underdeveloped countries to export a part of their workforce. But then in the 1970s, something changed. There was a global recession, more unemployment. And it is interesting because some political parties started in France to specialize on blaming everything on immigrants. So for instance, in 1978, there's a very interesting quote, 1 million immigrants is 1 million unemployed, too many unemployed people, 1 million unemployed people is 1 million immigrants too many. And economists disagree with that. They're like, no, it's not real. The man who said that is Jean-Marie Le Pen, the founder of the National Front. So there is something interesting because the neighborhood of La Goutte d'Or has always been related to these different stories of migration. And 1996, first in the 1980s, laws on immigration became much tougher in France. Nowadays, we live in a world where deportation are everywhere, but it has not always been the case. In the 1980s, there were the first charters. Charters were these flights sending undocumented people to where they were from. Nowadays, it's quite normal in Europe, but it has not always been the case. So in the 1990s, there were families who arrived in France legally, but the government then didn't want to renew the visas, etc. So they went there, they asked the priest the authorization to occupy the church, just the time to figure out something more humane. The government didn't like it, so they sent the riot police and they kicked everybody out in front of associations and celebrities that were here to show support to the family. So that's also a part of the identity of the neighborhood. But there is something else I would love to say about the neighborhood, because nowadays, whenever there's a problem in this neighborhood, by the way, I live like 5 minutes away from there whenever there's a problem in this neighborhood, people love to blame it on immigrants. Like, oh my God, the neighborhood was perfect, and then these immigrants from that country arrived, and then they changed everything. Okay, so just a few minutes away from this church, there's a square named Place de l'Assommoir, Assommoir Square. L'Assommoir is an old French novel from the 1870s by a really important French novelist named Émile Zola. And most of the action of the story takes place in the neighborhood of La Goutte d'Or in the 1860s, 1870s. It's a story of a young woman from the countryside who moved to Paris for better opportunities. And the whole story was how she struggled and how the working class back then was struggling with problems of housing, difficult conditions of working, addiction to alcohol, prostitution, etc. So what I'm trying to tell you is 150 years ago, the neighborhood already had a difficult neighborhood. And so I tell people, if I was a provocateur, I would tell you that back in the 1860s and 1870s, there was no African or Arabs in the neighborhood, and there were already problems. And back then, when they were trying to explain the problems in the neighborhood, they would tell you about the social conditions. And nowadays, whenever there's a problem in the neighborhood, it's because of this African immigration. And I think it's always very interesting to take a little bit of distance and to observe the way the neighborhood evolved and so on. And I want to leave you with an interesting image from the neighborhood. This is a place named Maison Château Rouge. It's a brand that is a sort of success story in the neighborhood. I know the founder of the neighborhood. His name is Youssouf Fofana. And about 10 years ago, he decided to create his own brand named Maison Château Rouge. Château Rouge, like this part of the neighborhood that is really West African and Congolese, and Maison, like house, but it's also a word that they use a lot in high fashion, like Maison Margiela or whatever. So he got the whole thing together, and there you go, you have Maison Château Rouge. And this is interesting because they have this sort of French Afro vibe that is quite fashionable at the time, and actually did it because you realized that a lot of people were appropriating African fashion, but it was never people of African descent doing it. So they started their brand like 8 years ago. It's been a huge success, and they do lots of collaborations with prestigious brands. So that was their first collaboration with Jordan brand, who asked them to create a pair of Air Jordans with the color of the neighborhood. So when I met with him and I asked him about that, he told me that as a teenage boy, he would never dream that an international company like Nike would be interested in this sort of French African identity that is something that most people have to be ashamed about. So there's an interesting look as well when you take people who are not from France, when you take visitors from America, from all over the world, and you bring them to this neighborhood, and they see beauty in a neighborhood that is always very stigmatized. And I think that's also the whole point in visiting this neighborhood. Voila, this is it for me. But I would be glad to take a few pictures. Just before I take the pictures, two things. For 3 years now, I collaborate with the Foundation for the Memory of Slavery. Their mission is to make slavery a more visible part of French history, and we do a podcast. It's basically conversations that I do with experts on a book related to the history of slavery and colonization. Most of the, if not all the episodes are in French, but I guess you're here to practice your French, so it's available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and voila. Thank you so much, and if you have questions, I'll take them. Merci.
Thank you so much, Monsieur Donat, for this very enlightening, very rich presentation. We do have about 20 minutes for questions if you do accept I answer them. So I'll just help facilitate. So just raise your hand, and then Stacy Michael has very kindly agreed to bring you the microphone so that everybody can hear. So the floor is now open for questions.
Sorry. Hi, Gabby. Thanks so much for a wonderful presentation. I have this kind of question about the way that race is represented in France and French discourse, popular and also kind of academic. And there's a lot of writing back and forth about this on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And so, this whole idea that if you want to say sort of, je suis, then you fill it in with an Americanism, black, rather than noir. That's very interesting. And so I'm wondering, you're actually sort of, you have your finger on the pulse of this kind of thing where you're actually talking to people on the street, you're leading them around Paris, and at the same time, you're kind of doing a really contemporary genre of public discourse here through the podcast. You probably have your pulse on this much better than I do, reading old articles about this topic, which is so, where do you see this sort of going? Do you think that French public discourse, do you think that people sort of on the street will start becoming more okay with talking about race more openly?
Yeah.
Or actually, do you see this as always kind of becoming this kind of sublimated, niche, we talk about that in this neighborhood, but that's not going to be a public discourse kind of thing. Yeah. Or do you see it going to a place where actually they could, discuss it more openly in a public setting? Thanks.
So I love the idea of public and private on these conversations, because with my black friends, actually, it became a sort of joke. Like the word black, we call each other "Salut les jeunes blacks," like "Hi, young black man" or something like that, because we want to sound like an older French person who's not comfortable acknowledging race. So that's what we love to do. But on the more public side, yes, it is. I think more and more people dare to say noir, for instance. There's even some conversations about ethnic statistics when you talk about acknowledging race. So it's a conversation that is happening. Not so long ago, I had a conversation with a sociologist who was complaining about the fact that she's working on identity, she's working on racial identity in France, and the fact that we don't have any official numbers about it for her. She has to do bad science. Once she wants to do like real studies about race, she has to use national identity, where were your grandparents born and something like that. So it's not as accurate as she would want it. So there are these kind of questions. Recently, our Secretary of Interior, he said that he's all for ethnic statistics as long as it's not used for affirmative action. It's like you can use ethnic statistics to prove that black people are criminal, but not to try to engage in a conversation about should we need more diversity in university. No, we're not doing that. So interesting, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you again for the talk. You mentioned, so just kind of piggybacking off of this conversation, as far as your friend, the researcher, working blind and having to extrapolate from ethnicity some sort of racialization praxis, how is this all tied in regarding identity politics, policing praxis, and without any reporting on hard data like this? So when you say like the authorities can only look at ethnic data as far as tying folks to crime. So is this then reported somehow?
Yes.
Is there recording in French census?
Not in the. So what I mean here is there are associations that would observe the way the police, for instance, in France is acting, and they came to a conclusion that if you are seen as black or Arab, you are maybe 10 more likely to be stopped and frisked by the police. And so you don't need to have a whole census. You don't need to have the census to know that black people are being like over-policed, for instance, in Paris or in the suburbs of Paris. It is documented for a very, very long time. What we don't have, for instance, is where we would need ethnic statistics, according to that sociologist, is, for instance, for mass incarceration of people of color. It's things like that where you need numbers to be able to observe that something weird or strange or is happening. And that part is kind of difficult to engage in a conversation. And also there's the fear, there's also the memory of World War II, where the Jewish community was being persecuted by the state. So it's something that also comes up in the conversation, that if you give all the ethnic data to a government and then the government turns evil, they might use it against persecuted minorities in France. So that's also like, oh, are we sure we want to open that door? We don't know what would happen in 5-10 years. We don't know. So it's a interesting question. It's not, I don't have a definitive position on that stuff. I understand that every country is different, and yeah. You're welcome. Question here?
Why do you think the French move away from saying je suis noir, even though that would be like the correct term, and try to use like the Anglicism of black? And would that be the same with other racial groups? Like here we'll have brown people as well, like to refer to like Hispanics or people from East Asia. How would you refer to them in France?
Okay, so the why black and not noir that you're asking, there are multiple theories. And the podcast I was telling you about, like named We Don't Say That, their theory is, in the 1980s, the first black people that you saw on French television, they were doing breakdance. It was like they were proud to say this is the first hip-hop show in the world. So it was basically young black kids, children of immigrants, children from Martinique, etc., who are breakdancing, and they were doing an American culture. So they became Les Blacks. And it was something positive because it's from America, it's hip, it's cool. But then the word stuck, and younger generations are like, yeah, there's something problematic in calling one of your ethnic minority with a foreign word when there's actually a word for a French word that is noir. There's also the idea that if you use a foreign word, then it makes it less real. If today people decided in America that black people were les noirs, every black person in America is a noir, it would probably make it less real, less because it's a foreign word. So that is an element. For other groups, well, actually, I would say that the first conversation about identity in France is not about black people, it's about North African Muslim people that are really like, it's the elephant in the room. And nobody really agrees on how to call this group, because most of the time you are not going to say les Arabes, the Arabs. So they would say les musulmans, the Muslims. But actually not every Muslim in France is Arab. A lot of actually Muslim people are from West Africa, for instance. But when you say musulman in France, everybody's talking about people coming from North Africa, basically Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and so on. And it's a lot of conversation in France. Or every week there's a new controversy about the way they can dress or their representation or something like that. So yeah, it's a very big question. But they are never called with an English word. They don't have the luxury of being American or cool or something like that. They're just les Arabes or les musulmans, and there's nothing exotic or sexy about it. Yeah?
Thank you so much. So much of that was really interesting, and it was a great overview. My question has to do with the current moment, or relatively current moment. In the last few years, while, first of all, acknowledging a Black history in Paris is already something that's so important. And because France likes to pretend it doesn't have this history, and sort of thinks of its colonial past as elsewhere. And But recently, because of multiple, coups in Africa, where there is this sort of active expulsion or rejection of France and its continued role and importance in countries that are independent, there is this kind of forced acknowledgement of the way in which that history ties into currents of migration and the sort of relationship with Black citizens. And very recently, Macron had that whole speech about how African countries wouldn't have been sovereign without France and things like that. And I'm wondering to what extent within the last 5 years or so, and even in the very current this very moment, to what extent are these things changing, informing how race is talked about, whether or not it is informing how people who live in France, right, are being seen vis-a-vis their quote unquote origins and or race, and sort of like how various identifications and ways of understanding people's histories are shifting.
I'm trying to understand. Are you saying that part of the problem is that the people, the minorities, the racialized people in France are from countries that used to be colonized by France and that have difficult relationship sometimes with France right now?
Right. What I'm saying is often a lot of these anti-immigration discourses, all of these racist discourses, kind of leave out the fact of colonization as a sort of origin story of these waves of immigration, right? And but also, with the whole universalist discourse of France, there's also a negation of any kind of cultural diversity and whatnot. So there's this attempt to sort of erase a past or erase anything African to African or Arab or. But right now there's this sort of like, what is happening in the world is making it harder for France. And even in that speech by Macron, where he is sort of saying they would not be sovereign without us, they wouldn't have not been sovereign without you, right? But there's like this, it's so easy to leave out the history, but it's right now, I feel like I'm wondering if it's getting harder to kind of perpetuate that erasure, if there's a way in which in the popular discourse, in the sort of, the way people are speaking about themselves and their relationship to France and the world, right? I'm wondering how that is transforming how people talk about themselves, how they talk about race and origins, etc., within France, hexagonal France.
I feel this contradiction in myself, like the question you're asking, because I am French, no question, but also I'm the result of the French colonial past because I'm from Martinique. Martinique is a French colony that, for some reason, remained part of France. So it's always very challenging to even to explain people how can I be French when people have an image of a French person necessarily being a white European or something like that. And what you're saying about that the position of France is changing in the world. It's not really my expertise. I don't want to talk about things that I don't know so much about. But I remember that our president a couple of years ago said that the French language, was the language of Pan-Africanism. And everybody was like, shut up. And I was like, no, let him cook. He's right, actually. Like it's actually almost a commercial for my tours, because it's true that most of the most brilliant black intellectuals in the world spent some time in Paris, studied in Paris, stayed in Paris. It's not just because of the Eiffel Tower and tourism and stuff like that, but it's also because colonial times, they had to study in the Latin Quarter of Paris. So there's this sort of very old connection between France and the Black Atlantic that sometimes France want to elevate and promote when it's convenient, but then when people want to talk about their identity, their problem of being accepted as French people, all of a sudden it's like, no, there's nothing to talk about. We're all French. Please don't ever mention that. It's just that sometimes I think it's not really coherent. Sometimes you want to be proud of your connection with la francophonie and stuff like that. And some other times, like, no, we don't need to talk about that. We're all French. We don't have time to talk about your different and things like that. So yeah, I understand your question, but I don't have like a definitive answer to that. Do you want it to elaborate?
I was just wondering if very recently, in the last few years,
Yeah.
this question, what people call themselves, you know,
Yeah.
whether you use the word noir or black or whatever, you know, the questions of how people identify, quote unquote, ethnically or racially. I'm wondering if those things have begun to shift because of this sort of greater attention being paid to, you know, the gaps that have been left in the story of Blackness in France.
I don't think there's a connection between the two. I don't think because the relationship between France and these other countries changed, that the French people whose families migrated to these, maybe actually, I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know. I'm sorry. Maybe. I'm not sure. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I'll take a turn. I really respect what you're doing, being a public, doing public history in these forums and making a difference is great. You sort of touched on this in the response to an earlier question, but I just want to invite you to say a little bit more about your sense for the interaction and engagement, synergies, disconnections, what's going on between, again, this is a huge thing, this is asking for your sense, but like Caribbean people in Paris, in France, in relation to Black African folks in Paris and France, in relation to Arab African folks, where are they? I mean, it's a complex triangular relationship in a sense, but I'm just curious to hear some of your thoughts and impressions about what's going on in terms of.
Yeah, so there are both solidarities and competition between these three groups that you mentioned. For instance, I talked about it with a really interesting historian named Dominique Chatron, and he wrote a book about why in France we are so sure that racism is not from here, that racism is something imported. And we're talking about, so I'm Caribbean and his family is also from the Caribbean, and he told me that French Caribbean were sometimes very ambiguous about racism because if we are, I don't know, in Paris, in Bordeaux, whatever, and something racist happened to us, we tend to say, you cannot do that because Martinique, where we're from, is French since 1635, so I'm a real French person, and don't be racist to me, please. And when we say something like that in front of other minorities, they're like, what are you doing? Like, do you mean that people who are from places that are not French for 400 years, it's okay if someone is racist to them? Is that what you're doing? So there is that. There are also lots of, there are moments of solidarity and complicity that are really interesting, I think. For instance, there's the African, how do you call that in English? It's like the tournament for African countries playing soccer with one another. AFCON, la CAN in French, right? And so most of these countries are represented in Paris. And for French people of Senegalese descent, of Algerian descent, of whatever, it's a moment where they come together, watch the game together, they make fun of one another. So you have these sort of beautiful moments of, at the same time, people, I don't know, joke with one another, but also it's a moment of solidarity where minorities are really happy to wave the flag of their parents or something like that. So that's the kind of things that are really powerful, these moments that are quite powerful in Paris. There are also exchange between people from the Caribbean, the French West Indies, and people from West Africa when it's time to talk about music, for instance. Paris is a place where you have all these kind of connections that are, in my opinion, very interesting. And these kind of things does not happen in so many places in the world where you would have all these different type of communities that interact with one another. And for that reason, I think Paris is interesting as well. Here.
Greetings, how you doing?
Hey.
One of the questions that I would like to ask you is in relation to gentrification, because gentrification is a global thing, and when I think about Paris, I think about it being one of the first places where gentrification began, like years ago in the 90s, when there was a lot of pushback, there was fires, as they were pushing Arabs out, and people that look like us out of the city area. And so I'm wondering, your tours, do you address those issues in terms of how gentrification has affected Paris and the communities that lived inside and how they pushed them out, because that's what they're doing everywhere globally.
Yes, I talk about it a lot, but I also talk about how different it is, because when you walk around the last neighborhood I was talking about, the presence of black people in this area is not as old as the presence of black people in Harlem or in Brooklyn, for instance. And this is not where most of the gentrification is happening. Like, it's the most visible gentrification, but it's not where the most gentrification is happening. Most of the gentrification does not happen in Paris, but actually right outside of Paris. Like, Paris is surrounded by some suburbs, big suburbs. Actually, most people in the region of Paris live in the suburb than they live in Paris. The suburbs are bigger than the city. And the northern and the eastern suburbs of Paris became very racialized, you would say. Like in the, what you guys would call in English, the project, it was built right outside of Paris. And these past 10 years, 20 years, there are smaller cities like Saint-Denis, where the Olympics took place, or Saint-Ouen, or Pantin, Aubervilliers. All these cities used to have a really rough reputation. And it was just like immigrants and children of immigrants living there. And these past 10 years, some Parisians realized that, oh, it's not so bad, I want to live there. And then all of a sudden, everything is changing. So now you have organic supermarkets and you have a lot of activities. And basically, I'm just going to sum up this way. Like every one of these cities say, we are the Brooklyn of Paris. We are the Pantin, c'est le nouveau Brooklyn. Saint-Ouen, c'est le nouveau Brooklyn. Saint-Denis, c'est le nouveau... So yeah, an idea of gentrification that gives you an idea of what this means when they are talking about that. And it's a lot of questions, because people will tell you, oh, I love how diverse these neighborhoods are. And then you ask, actually there was a documentary about that, are your children going to public school or private Catholic schools in Paris? Like, oh no, but no, they're not going in the local school there. So yeah, it's a lot of questions like that. It's a lot of issues that you would understand as Americans, for instance, so yeah.
Yes, but there was an area where there were like back-to-back barbershops and beauty parlors that were mainly catering to communities of people who look like us from the Caribbean and Africa and what have you. Have those businesses been affected by gentrification that was going on in Paris?
Not too much, because it's mostly hubs. So a lot of people who use these services that you mentioned, they don't even live in the neighborhood in the first place. They might live 10 miles away, take the train to go there to buy or access the services they will not have where they live. So this is not really changing that much, even though there are efforts to say, okay, it's too many black barbers here, they need to move, but for now, they're resisting. So if you go in areas like Château d'Eau, Strasbourg-Saint-Denis, Château Rouge, etc., you will still see a lot of places for African clothing or barbers, hairdressers, and stuff like that. They're still around. They are not moving right now.
One more question?
Yes, I just want to say that I'm so grateful to be here. And I am very interested in what you've been saying. I don't think that you're aware of that. Well, I am a graduate of University of Houston, like about 10 years ago, and my study was in humanities and cultural studies, and also had a focus on anthropology. And it was very interesting. So that what you are talking about, identity, is very, very, very important. And being here in America, I know you read your background coming from Martinique.
That's right.
Actually, my family, you're speaking of French, Paris, Parisian, or whatever. My family speaks French Creole. And nowadays, well, back in the days, as those people really never came out of that area, Louisiana. Well, they say the Louisiana Purchase, and we read all that about in history, which is great. Everybody have a place where they're coming from. But it was a lot going on. You probably heard of New Orleans, and with them speaking a little bit of French patois and all this, whatever they want to call it. But I do a history on that also, and knowing that the French had been there, as we all know, since the 1700s. I don't know if you ever went to New Orleans.
Yeah, a year and a half ago. Yeah.
You have?
Yeah.
Well, then they did leave a legacy there. which is very interesting. So I would advise anyone, if they haven't been, to just really, take a tour there and as you go on your way, because it's very interesting and has left a lot of just remembrance from back in the days, the 1800s. And actually, my family going back came from Martinique.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
Fascinating.
I
Okay.
find it very interesting and it's very becoming. I always have had a very strong liking for the University of Houston, because when I came through my when I came through my career, being in that area, it was so interesting, and I see that they're still going strong with it. Yeah, great. Thank you for that.
Thank
for
you.
being here.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Okay, can we please thank Monsieur Donald?
Merci. Thank you, everyone.